Hello, I'm Ed Gallagher, President of the American Scandinavian Foundation, welcoming you to a virtual panel discussion entitled Greenland, Past, Present, and Future. This panel is produced and presented by the American Scandinavian Foundation, which was founded in New York over 110 years ago, dedicated to the mission to build international understanding through educational and cultural exchange. We do this today through an extensive program of scholarships, fellowships, publications, and public programs, exhibitions, screenings, concerts, children's activities, and programs such as this, which are offered online and at our headquarters, Scandinavia House, the Nordic Center in America, located on Park Avenue in New York City. For more information about the American Scandinavian Foundation, consult amscan.org or scandinaviahouse.org. It's now my pleasure to ask Lori Fredrickson, Manager of Communications at ASF and producer and panel of this panel, to introduce the speakers. Lori, it's all yours.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today, and thanks especially to our panelists in today's discussion on Greenland, past, present, and future. Ulrik Pram Gad is a senior researcher on Arctic identity, diplomacy, and security for the Danish Institute of International Studies. His core research interest concerns how identities are constituted and negotiated by and in opposition to the nation state, particularly in how these processes shape and are shaped by diplomacy and security politics. His work focuses on the Greenlandic-Danish relation as part of regional Arctic or global security configurations, or places the relation in comparative perspective. Conceptually oriented projects have focused on securitization, sovereignty, paradiplomacy, post-coloniality, and sustainability. His recent projects include a volume on Greenland and Arctic security, entangled desecuritization dynamics under climatic thaw and geopolitical freeze, available from University of Michigan Press. In 2020 to 2024, he directed the collaborative research project, Imagining Independence in the Arctic, Greenland's Post-Colonial Politics of Comparison, which analyzes with whom and how Greenland compares itself when seeking inspiration for how to develop towards independence. A series of small policy projects with the University of Greenland have aimed to enhance the common Greenland-Danish knowledge base on foreign security and defense politics under hybrid sovereignty, including 2 seminars on free association after the new Greenlandic draft constitution. Since 2014, he has organized the Arctic Politics Seminars, which serve as a core research infrastructure environments across the humanities and the social sciences working on Greenlandic and Arctic projects. Gordon F. Sander graduated from Cornell University with a bachelor's in history in 1973. His career as a foreign correspondent began in 1976 with a profile of the Netherlands in the New York Times magazine, after which he became a regular contributor to both the paper's styles and education sections. His byline has since appeared in over 60 leading American, British, and European newspapers, magazines, and news sites, including Financial Times, the New York Review of Books, Rolling Stone, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Wilson Quarterly, Daily Telegraph, Politico, and the Christian Science Monitor. He additionally writes for the Washington Post, where he recently wrote an essay on the history of United States-Greenlandic relations. He is the author of 7 books, including Sterling, The Rise and Twilight of Television's Last Angry Man, The Frank Family That Survived, The 100-Day Winter War, Off the Map, A Personal History of Finland, Comeback Coach, and Rooms, The Works and Life of J.J. Manford. His newest book, Finnish Frontline, Kekkonen, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and the Cold War, will be published this fall by Cornell University Press. He was an artist in residence at his alma mater, Cornell University, from 2002 to 2004, and he is also an active photographer and journalist, and photojournalist. In 2017, President Sauli Niinistö of Finland awarded him the Order of the Lion for his contributions to literature and the arts. He's currently based in Riga, Latvia. And finally, our moderator today is Thorsten Wagner, the Executive Director of FASPE, and who has been involved with the organization since its beginnings in 2009. He is a German historian who grew up in Denmark and completed his undergraduate studies at the University of Tübingen, Germany, and his graduate work at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, the Technical University Berlin, and the Free University of Berlin, earning his master's from Technical University Berlin in 1998. Living in Berlin for almost 2 decades, Thorsten worked as a research fellow for the Danish Center for the Holocaust and Genocide Studies and started teaching at the Humboldt University in Berlin. From 2010 to 2019, he held a permanent position as associate professor of the Danish Institute for Study Abroad, University of Copenhagen. Having authored numerous academic publications in the fields of modern German and European Jewish history, anti-Semitism, Holocaust studies, cultures of memory, and Israeli history and society, he also worked as the historical consultant for the acclaimed documentary Germans and Jews, dealing with the contemporary Germany, its relationship to its Nazi past, and the reemergence of Jewish life. He, his wife Johanna, and their 2 children live in New York City. We would like to note that today's discussion had originally included a Greenlandic speaker, and that we had hoped to have representation from Greenland in this panel. However, due to the current political situation, they are presently not permitted to participate in events involving U.S. organizations. We hope to return to this conversation with Greenlandic speakers in the event that this changes. I will now turn the conversation over to our moderator, Thorsten Wagner.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you for the warm welcome for all of us, but also thanks a lot to Gordon and Ulrik for joining this discussion here. I'm just the guy who asks some questions mainly, but Ulrik and Gordon are really the experts, and my involvement mainly is against the backdrop of getting more and more involved also with the work of the American Scandinavian Foundation, which I'm very grateful for. Where I would like to get us started, perhaps, is just to emphasize or perhaps state the obvious, and that is that there are so many dimensions of this problem, and we will, within this hour that we have at our disposal, obviously only be able to touch on a certain number of issues that Gordon and Ulrik would like to discuss. I hope kind of that we can get out of the tension on the one hand of having this constant flow of symbolic politics or presence in social media versus these deeper structural changes that, of course, we see on so many levels, and that we together can help lift this out of the anxieties of the 24-hour news cycle and perhaps get a little bit of a deeper approach to this, both in terms of the societies that we're talking about here and also the relationships between them at the same time. The different dimensions that I see that I hope that we'll be able to touch on are obviously the big elephant in the room, and that is the rapidly rising importance of the Arctic as a part of the world. Somebody recently wrote that basically, depending on how we define it, obviously, it has the size of Africa. So we are talking about a really significant part of the world. We want to talk about the historical contexts ranging from US-Danish relations, US-Greenland relations, but obviously also the whole question of how all of this affects what in Denmark is known as the community of the realm or the Commonwealth of Denmark and the Danish crown, which of course also has been in a dramatic change. And perhaps as a last point, we very much also want to talk about the current political moment. What does this, let's call it, renewed American interest in Greenland tell us about America? In what way, in what situation is Greenland currently? And how does its political elite, its leadership, but also its society react to these tumultuous events in many ways? Where do these events over the last couple of months and years fit into the struggle for independence? And what does it mean, both for Denmark, but particularly also for a broader European context of redefining their position in the world? Is this in many ways even a prism for us to see a new world order or a new world structure that might not be so orderly seeing developing here? I think an important point is here that, of course, in many ways, both an American and a Danish perspective will have their blind spots. And unfortunately, we are not able to have that Greenlandic voice here on this discussion. But I hope that in many ways, Ulrik and Gordon's expertise at least will help us to some degree to compensate this. Ulrik, I read recently a reference by you where you talked about how this asymmetry in many of these relationships also become visible through the fact that as a Dane, and let me just call myself a Dane for this purpose, you can live most of your life without thinking about Greenland. And when I read that, I was thinking about, well, until you hear the New Year's speech when the monarch might make some reference to the community of the realm. but that has been very much changing for Danes currently, and obviously also for Americans, there's been much more of a presence for Greenland. And what I would hope that we could address when we get into the most current events of the visit of J.D. Vance, the Vice President, and the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, is of course that these developments of the last few days and weeks in many ways meet Denmark in a situation where a new narrative about its North Atlantic relationships is developing, and Greenland very much has to think about its future in a rapidly changing world between a focus on mining and industrialization on the one hand, and the potentials of revitalizing its indigenous traditions and culture on the other. We all have seen the references, the visits, the images of Vance flying in for a 3-hour visit to the airbase in what now is called Pitufik. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, admittedly, which over decades was known as Thule. I wonder what you take away from this, what your impressions were of this obviously slightly undiplomatic visit, where some commentators have made the point that a press conference was given where Vance said things that he could have said in the other place, and it doesn't seem that this was about learning anything or experiencing anything, and also the political appeal of Vance to the Greenlanders was done without even getting close to anybody living in Greenland. But what was your take on these developments of the last few days and weeks, Ulrik?
I think this idea of looking at this as asymmetrical is very telling in two ways, because, you know, of course, as you mentioned, Danes can go on most of their lives without thinking about Greenland. Greenland cannot. Greenlanders really, when you're as a Greenlander, you look at the world, Denmark comes in the way all the time. Until recently, most of the planes coming out of Greenland went to Copenhagen. All the goods in the local supermarket comes from Denmark. Most of the fish you export go via Denmark. If you go to the municipal office, and you might meet a Dane as the social worker there, because Greenland doesn't really produce the human resources themselves that they need. But then when Vance put himself in the picture, it in a sense, this asymmetry perhaps was put in contrast, in the sense that maybe there's a lot of Danes that don't know anything about Greenland and doesn't understand Greenland, but this way of talking about Greenland that comes out of Vance, but also comes out of some of the social media products that the Trump bubble is producing, and some of the international journalists descending on Nuuk for the election campaign, was really, that's another level or another dimension of ignorance concerning what kind of society Greenland is. And I think that was felt very, very immediately in Greenland also.
Gordon, would you like to chip in? What is your perspective on these current events?
Yes.
And either of you,
Well,
perhaps you can also talk a little bit about what the perceptions of people living in Greenland was of this visit.
Well, because, you know, my perspective is as an American and as an American historian. And I just, talk about asymmetry and ahistorical. This is just an anomalous moment in American foreign relations. I mean, the fact that one of our closest allies, we are now approaching an adversarial position with Denmark has been one of our closest allies, for years. And the fact that we have the foreign minister of Denmark reprimanding the vice president of our country, this is such an incredible moment. And I have to say, on behalf of my country, I'm embarrassed for my country, because I love my country. One of the reasons why I'm here in Europe is I like to think I'm representing my country here. And so it's very difficult for me. It's a very embarrassing and difficult moment for me as an American here in Europe, and also as a friend of Denmark. And I just want to interject this personal note. I love Denmark, and my whole interest in this region comes from the fact that my my father took refuge in Denmark. And the fact that, now we're talking about the possibility of America going to war with Denmark. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen, but just the fact that people even talking about that is just so, it's just so incredible. So this is just the point I'm making. This is just a very bizarre and strange moment in American history, I'm embarrassed for my country. To put it in a historical perspective, I have to underline, this is not the first time that America has expressed interest in Greenland. We had a President Johnson, and we had a Secretary of State, Seward, and we've had other presidents who had designs on Greenland, but we've never had a president who's gone about it in the way that he has, And the fact that this visit by the vice president was done in a very undiplomatic fashion. I don't think he even gave notice that they were, basically our vice president, he just parachuted into Greenland, And I just think the way they went about it it's just remarkable to me, So this is just the point I'm trying to make, I guess. It's just a very strange and bizarre moment, for my country and in the history of American foreign relations, and also in the history of the relations between, America and Denmark, which has always been, collegial, So it's just, I'm still basically getting my head around this. And I think a lot of Americans are also. And I know that I can't believe that there are many Americans who are supportive of, Mr. Trump's designs on Greenland. And I think even if he had even said this during this campaign, I think there was a reason why he didn't say very much about his interest in Greenland in his campaign. I don't think people really support this, So the big question, I think, is how this is going to play out in the end. And of course, I think we should talk about that a little later. But I'm really wondering how this is going to play out.
Thank you, Gordon. I'd like to turn this to Ulrik, but still stay on the topic of perhaps Danish-American relations for a moment, if we can. And Ulrik, you've talked about security arrangements. We might talk a little bit more about that also. I've written about it, rather. Talk about that a little bit later. But I think it's important just to state that, of course, the fact that there is a base in northern or northwestern Greenland now is coming out of decades of security arrangements, complicated integrated security arrangements, where Greenland, of course, for decades has played a very central role in the American defense systems during the Cold War, in terms of an early warning system against Soviet and then Russian attacks. And the moment that Vance, just to remind all of us of that, is that Denmark is not protecting Greenland, and for that matter, the base. He's also ignoring or questioning these decades of cooperation. And in some ways, also, you could argue the NATO alliance itself, right? Denmark being one of the founding members of NATO, the fact that there is a mutual defense obligation that, of course, after 9/11 actually played a role for American participants in this conversation here. What people might not be aware of is that more Danish soldiers ended up being killed in the Afghan war than American soldiers, if we look at the size of these countries. So what does this moment tell us about the situation in your analysis of Danish-American relations?
I think maybe I'll
one comment. I mean, just to emphasize what you just said, Thorsten, I would like Ulrik's reaction to what Mr. Vance said about how Denmark is not doing a good job for Greenland. I mean, what is your response to that?
Yeah, I'll come to that, but I'll circle back to the thing about asymmetry, because I think that when I was preparing for this, chatting to Gordon yesterday, I think he was making a very valid point that the Americans electing Trump didn't think of either Greenland or Europe or Denmark when they elected Trump. They were out for something else, and that, in a sense, testifies to another kind of asymmetry, right? If you're an American, you can go about most of your life without thinking much about the rest of the world, about Europe, and you can basically base your voting on things that are close to you, but it has very drastic, dramatic effects in terms of foreign policy for the rest of the world. And in that sense, I think
that's a very good point. Just make a very quick point. One of the things that strikes me as a foreign correspondent based here in Europe is how little when I go home, is how little Americans know about the rest of the world. I mean, I live in Latvia, and I think 9 out of the 10 people I meet in America, they don't even know where Latvia is. So that sort of tells you everything. But please continue.
But the thing is, if we look at the United States from Europe and indeed from Greenland as well, the attraction of the United States have been that it talked in terms and conducted foreign policy in terms of values that we liked, that we could mirror. Sometimes the US did stuff that didn't live up to those ideals in itself, but as Thorsten said, it was still important for us to show the US that basically we were good friends and allies, and that's in a sense was why Denmark sent soldiers to Afghanistan without perhaps the Danish public was really convinced that it made sense all the way. So this idea that to quote another Scandinavian philosopher here, P.P. Longstocking, who said that if you're really strong, you need to be really good. And in a sense, when Europeans were looking at the United States, that was basically not a total image, but it was the basic trust that Europeans could have in Americans.
You just mentioned a very good point instantly. It's not to interrupt you, Ulrik, but that Danish soldiers died fighting alongside American soldiers in Afghanistan. I think that's a very important point. But please continue.
Because now I've been talking about Europe and Denmark, I'd like to circle back to Greenland actually, because there the relation has been historically to the United States kind of double, in the sense that first time most Greenlanders met Americans were during the Second World War, where Germany occupied Denmark. The connections were cut off, and in that sense it was a very acute situation that no one provided the goods that Greenlanders supplemented their hunting and fisheries with. So in that sense, there was an urgent security situation for Greenlandic civil population, and the US stepped in, providing Greenlanders with the goods they needed, and they even did so in a more interesting and modern way than the Danish colonial administration had done so, in that because they, instead of going to the colonial monopoly buying the same boring stuff, you could order all kinds of things from a Sears and Roebuck catalog. So in that sense, to many Greenlanders, the US stood as a land of opportunity and as a way of opening up this relation to Denmark, opening up to the world. On the other hand, it was also felt, particularly as it kind of dragged on into the Cold War, as a kind of not an occupation, but there were Greenlanders forcefully removed to make room for the Thule Air Base, and in that sense, these two narratives about what the U.S. have coexisted in Greenlandic policies.
I just want to interject for a second, because you mentioned about what America and Greenland during World War II, and I want to ask this of Ulrik, because he's really the expert on Greenlandic history. The United States did occupy Greenland, and now I've seen it written several places that we invaded Greenland. Would that be a correct way of characterizing what we did with Greenland? Did the United States invade Greenland after the Germans invaded Denmark? I think this is relevant because now people are talking about the second invasion of Greenland. did we invade Greenland in the first place?
Legally speaking, there was a Danish ambassador to the United States that signed a treaty instead of listening to what his occupied government at home told him. He signed a treaty with the U.S. Asking the U.S. to take care of Greenland while Denmark was under occupation. And in that sense, it wasn't legally an invasion. For most Greenlanders, it immediately felt as kind of an opening up to the world. But then there was also a lot of distinct places in Greenland where the U.S. installations kind of pushed people away from their hunting grounds, from their everyday life. So in that sense, there was an element of invasion of a space also. And where I'm trying to get it at, that these two narratives have been alive in Greenlandic political discourse. And if we scroll back just a year from now, all the Greenlandic parties were gearing up for elections. They basically looked to the U.S. For another opening up of the relation to Denmark, in the sense that now we have these new airports. We can have goods flown in from elsewhere than Denmark. We can export fish elsewhere. We can have tourists, etc. So all Greenlandic political parties were looking to the U.S. as an opening to the world. The trouble, of course, was that the first plane that actually descended on the new international airport in Trump Jr.'s plane, and then Trump started talking about not ruling out military invasion, etc. The first narrative, the positive narrative, was pushed aside, and by now most Greenlanders' primary vision of current U.S. relation is a threat rather than an opportunity.
You mentioned the elections. You made a lot of points here, but I think it's very important about the elections. And you made the point, one of the questions that you want to ask, I think, is that what was the significance of the last elections, and were you surprised by the results?
I think there's a lot of domestic reasons behind the election results that's difficult for outsiders to comprehend when now everything's about Trump and independence and stuff like that. But really, there was a disenchantment with the two parties that's been in power in Greenland for the last decades, basically building up this Greenlandic welfare state that was under the autonomy government. And particularly, there was a lot of this disenchantment with fisheries reform, and nobody else than Greenlanders and perhaps Norwegians and Icelanders understand that fisheries policies is really important, because that's basically the whole of the Greenlandic economy. So there's a disenchantment that didn't have anything to do with Trump or Denmark or anything else. And then, in a sense, the protest or disenchantment with these two established parties was led in two directions. There was one party, the Nalarak party is a pretty secessionist party. All the people who were disenchanted with the status quo but blaming Denmark, they would go to the Nalarak party. And in the other direction, those who were disenchanted with the status quo, that were more afraid of Trump, they would go to the Democrats. So now the incoming government is basically based on the moderate opposition to the established parties and the old established parties. So in that sense, the result of Trump's intervention in Greenlandic politics have been to push Greenlanders and the Greenlandic political system away from the US.
I know that we are zigzagging a little bit in the topics. So I'll try to get a little bit more of the structure back into our conversations. Ulrik, with your permission, I'd like to go back and open up the broader complexities of Greenland-Danish relationships in a moment. But Gordon, first a question for you, so we can hear a little bit more from you about your expertise. Can you give us a sense of where the current moment, what we see right now, fits into the history of the American interest in Greenland, and also where Trump is coming from? You could argue, let me just say that before you get going, you could argue that there's nothing that America cannot get from Denmark, or for that matter, Canada, as another front, through alliances, right? There's even all kinds of easy access for American companies to get to the mineral resources. America could say, we want to expand the military presence and the military bases. Ulrik can talk about what that would mean if we have a more military presence in the Arctic. That's a whole problem of itself. But perhaps you can help us understand where this current moment fits in. Why is Trump so interested in Greenland? And how does it fit into the last 100, 200 years of American interest in Greenland?
Well, as I said before, there is a history of American interest in Greenland. And of course, we have to remind our listeners that Trump did express interest in Greenland during his first term, that no one really took him that seriously. But now apparently he's much more serious about it, And I think this is surprising. I think even probably Vice President Vance is surprised, I think it's very interesting that when Vance was in Greenland, one of the things he said was that we have to make the president happy, that we have to keep the president's desires in mind. I mean, it's just the fact that the vice president was saying this is just incredible. I personally don't think Mr. Trump has really thought out the consequences of what he's doing right now. I mean, just the practical consequences. I mean, let's just pan out and let's say America got Greenland. I mean, can you realistically see America governing Greenland? I can't. I mean, there's going to be a Greenlandic resistance movement, I mean, it just doesn't play out. The whole thing is just mad. So it's a very strange moment and a very anomalous moment in both American-Danish relations and also in the history of the liberal world order. And I think we're talking about the greater implications of what Trump is doing. Also it has it's important for what Russia is doing with Ukraine, because basically you may have, I'm sure you heard that basically Mr. Putin has basically signed off the other day on Mr. Trump's designs on Greenland. He gave this news conference in which he said, yes, it's long, America has always been interested in Greenland. We shouldn't be that surprised, So, I mean, in a way, this was like a signal to Trump that Putin doesn't have a problem with what he's trying to do with Greenland, And of course, now China is also looking at what's happening. And China may see this as a signal, okay, yes, well, if Trump is going to take Greenland, then maybe it's okay for us to take Taiwan, So it's just the ripples from what he's doing are resonating around the world and disrupting this world order. And it's really, it's really a scary moment, So of course we can talk about the history, but this is an ahistorical moment. I'm amongst other things, I'm an American historian, and we are living through an ahistorical moment, and there are very few precedents, for what's happening right now, and there's no precedent for what Mr. Trump is trying to do, and so I think that's, it's just a very strange moment,
Thank you, Gordon.
It'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. And also, one other point, and of course, it'll be interesting to see what how the American public feels about this, what the polls are saying. Do Americans really want to take over Greenland? I don't think so. And if that's the case, will Trump listen to that? Or is he just listening to himself? I think he's just listening to himself.
Gordon, I would like towards the end of our conversation to get back to the whole question about the global context and Putin. But before we get there, I feel that there is still a large area that we should develop a little bit more. And perhaps, Ulrik, I can bring you back in here and ask you a question that has 2 or 3 different components here. You started talking about the question and the struggle for independence and where the elections fit in. Perhaps you can widen the perspective a little bit there and say, what do what does the Greenlandic population imagine? And I'm sure there are different perspectives there in terms of both speed and also scope of that independence, what it should look like in terms of what it implies to other players and also the old colonial, former colonial power Denmark. But perhaps you can help us understand when both people in Greenland and in Denmark talk about the community of the realm. The point has been made that the problem is in many ways that the stories that are told about that community are very different. And I think that it helps all of us to understand in what ways they're different. I think Kirsten Tiste once made the point that we Danes like to talk about a shared history, but in many ways it's more of an entangled one. We already talked about the asymmetry, but perhaps you can tell us about the different narratives that are connected with that. And finally, just to really put one on top of everything, help us a bit understand what you have in your writings discussed in terms of sovereignty games. You've made a very interesting point about how Greenland in many ways has tried to maneuver international relations and international institutions, and particularly also the European Union, in this struggle for independence. And I wonder how your analysis over the last 5, 10, 15 years perhaps changed now with America being so present on that stage?
I think if you zoom out to the very, very long joy almost here, is the point is that Greenlanders have been seeking equality. That's basically what they've been seeking. And there was a period in the 30s and 40s, maybe into the 50s, that the main way of seeking equality was to seek equality as a Danish citizen like everyone else. And that's kind of what got this formal decolonization in 1953 running, where Greenland went from being a colony to being just another part of Denmark in formal terms. Then Denmark began this large modernization drive so that Greenland would have equal services, etc., living standards as the other Danes living far away. Of course, that felt, because it was organized from very much from Copenhagen without any very solid Greenlandic representation in the process, then it very soon turned into a disenchantment of Greenlanders with this kind of equality because it didn't materialize. So the next kind of equality that was aimed for was equality not as individual citizens, but equality as another people of the world. And having been living with Danes for a long time, of course, the impression was that the best way of being a people in the world is to be pretty culturally homogenous and have your own state. So in that sense, the Greenlandic nationalism was born, and at least for the last 30 years or so, there's basically been a consensus in the Greenlandic political system that Greenland ought to be an independent nation state like all other nation states. Of course, it's difficult because there's such a small population on such a big territory. So it's not a thing that anyone has imagined should happen tomorrow, but it's been a goal of a long-term development for a long time. And in that process, Denmark has kind of been increasingly, the Danish officials, ministries and ministers have been increasingly helpful in the sense that they've tried to present the constitutional relation, which you label here the community of the realm. It's a weird word, it's even weirder word in Danish, and it's even worse in Greenlandic. But it's kind of an oxymoron. Say, a realm, that's something hierarchical. There's sovereignty one place and underlings elsewhere. But a community in Danish and also the Greenlandic version is more of a lateral communal thing that you have together. But even in spite of this formal Danish sovereignty, the Danish authorities have tried to conduct politics, particularly foreign politics and security politics, in a way that made Greenlanders feel equal. So that's why I label sovereignty games. They play games with the Danish formal sovereignty to produce a feeling of equality. And that's basically why we have U.S. consulate in Nuuk, right? So to facilitate Greenlanders, the government of Greenland talk directly to a foreign power, even though if you read the Danish constitution, you would think that, okay, foreign policy, that's a thing for the government in Copenhagen, but really trying to produce a sense of equality. Of course, the Greenlandic government, likewise the Faroese, they're in a similar situation, kind of keep hitting their head on the Danish constitution, so to say. So this process of making constitutional relation equal is not done, and maybe it will never be, but it's been facilitating this opening up of Greenlandic diplomatic possibilities.
Thank you, Ulrik. I just wanted to add that what, of course, also is part of that picture, Ulrik, I'm sure, is what gets pushed into the background, and that is a inner Danish discourse over the last few years that really has started to chip away from this idea of being the generous and benevolent former colonial power, and much more an awareness of, from the implementation of IUDs to the long-term consequences of relocation in certain kind of more urban standards or context, to larger number of children being taken to boarding schools and then perhaps adopted away, right? There are many kind of critical discourses in Denmark where Denmark just over the last few years, slowly but finally, has started to confront these ghosts of its own colonial history. And it's interesting that there's this simultaneity of conflicts at the same time.
You know, Thorsten explains how Danes are getting better at listening to Greenlanders than they have been, but also at the same time, the Greenlandic discourse about what independence means, what a sovereign state would mean, is also becoming more nuanced, in the sense that basically no Greenlanders want to cut all ties to the rest of the world and sail away in the Arctic Ocean by themselves. They know that if they are sovereign one day, they'll still need a very tight association with someone. And in a sense, those two directions take Greenland and Denmark closer than they have been before. And this is just to get back to Ebbe, who, if he'd been here, that's one of his points, is that, and exactly because we are starting to listening to each other, that makes a lot of noise, because the Greenlanders, in a sense, now feel encouraged and that they are taken serious with some of the complaints that early on were just closed down. So even if the understanding is perhaps getting there, then it really sounds very dramatic at the moment, and that of course opens up for.
Let me just ask you a question. You know, one of the paradoxes of this situation, it seems to me, is that Trump's interest in Greenland is bringing Greenland and Denmark together. Is that the case? And also, just to bring us up to date, the latest from yesterday, we have from Mr. Nielsen, the new head of government in Greenland. He was interviewed by Reuters, and he said that Greenland will never be a part of America. We want to trade, we want a strong partnership, of course, but we want it in mutual respect. We will never be safe, and we will never be Americans. And then in relationship with Denmark, he says, we don't want to be Americans. We don't want either to be Danes in the future. We want to be independent. But right now, we are part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And that's how it's going to be. You know, and I wonder, would he have said that last year?
I think most of the quote is basically a paraphrase of the slogan. I think Greenlanders, the government of Greenland came up with when Trump was first interested, saying that we're not for sale, we're open for business. And then the next version of that came this time, that exactly the outgoing prime minister says, we we don't want to be Americans, we don't want to be Danes, we want to be Greenlanders. So in that sense, the new incoming prime minister is echoing what has been the consensus of most Greenlanders for the last years. But the final sentence you quoted, that right now we're in the kingdom of Denmark, and that's where we're working from. I think that is a change of tone which is provoked by Trump's what is in Greenland taken as an aggression.
From what I'm seeing, the videos of the demonstrations in Nuuk, there is a real anti-American sentiment in Greenland right now. I'm not sure that was the case a few years ago. You know, I mean, Americans, I think you said the other day that Greenlanders are actually they're really worried about the possibility of an American invasion. I mean, this is new, is it not?
I wouldn't. My feeling is not that there is an anti-Americanism, but there's really an anxiety directed towards the current administration, Trump's person, but also the way the wider administration and political system in the United States doesn't kind of check and balance or control Trump in any way, the way it's playing up to his weird ideas. So, and in that sense, the anxiety is begins with Trump, but it gets widened out to refer, of course, to wider segments of what the United States is, because there's a feeling as I read Greenlandic social media and the people I talk to, there's a kind of pride that they managed to stand up and making these demonstrations that are for Greenlandics. Greenland have small cities, but it's really been a lot of people, and they even managed to come up with things they really liked in as social media content, in the sense that some of the slogans were pretty funny and showed that they had humor even under duress. So in that sense, I don't think there's anyone taking tranquilizers, but there's a pride and a determination that this shouldn't be allowed to play out.
Of course, I don't want to exaggerate anything, but again, I've been looking at the videos of these demonstrations in Nuuk. It really seems to me that there was an anti-American movement in Greenland, and the beginnings of what would be a resistance movement in the future, you know, if America ever took over Greenland.
Just that Greenlanders are practical and peaceful people. They know it doesn't make any sense to start shooting at anyone. They're just a bit anxious, perhaps, that the American president doesn't understand that.
Thank you both. What I'd like to do is to turn our question into our conversation into the last chapter that we can deal with for the last 5-8 minutes, and then we'll perhaps take some questions that might be going in different directions. Gordon, Ulrik, what I would love us to talk about here at the end of our interesting conversation is a perspective forward, so to speak, what we expect. We touched on that in some ways, but I think one of the overarching aspects here to me seems to be that the argument from the new American administration has again and again been about security, right? And that the threat in the Arctic that has been invoked by Trump is supposedly one of Russia, one of Putin's Russia. But the irony, and that is leading me to my question, is of course that at the same time, it's this US government that supports Russia, at least verbally, in its war against the Ukraine in many ways, and weakens that fight of the Ukraine. And that's where the question that for me hovers above all of this is there any kind of clear concept behind this kind of approach? Or is this just senselessness, basically, and undermining and even counterproductive for American interests in this approach? And the general picture for me seems to be, of course, that in all that potential senselessness of this approach, that we nevertheless see a new way of defining international relations, and that Greenland becomes the lens, the crystallization point of that new world order that is a world order of zero-sum games in many ways, and is a world order, I don't know if neo-colonialist is the right word, but a world order that accepts, and that goes back to Gordon's point earlier about Putin signing off or not, that accepts spheres of influence, right? To say, yes, it's fine that Russia has its dominance over certain parts of Central Eastern Europe. And with that, it's fine that America, almost like the Monroe Doctrine, controls North America or more than that, including Greenland. So where do we go from here? What do you expect? And is there a line through all of this that goes in a certain direction, or is it just counterproductive and messy? Gordon, do you want to start?
Well, yes, as I said before, I think this has the potential of going in a very messy direction. I think that, Putin, of course, we don't know what Putin's thinking. And so, it's very difficult to figure out exactly what he's thinking. I think Mr. Putin wants to be, Peter the Great. He's trying to recreate the Soviet Empire. And I think he sees Trump as sort of, well, I think he's playing Mr. Trump, but he kind of understands Trump's imperial ambitions. And I think there's another point I want to make. Talk about security arrangements. I doubt if you asked Mr. Trump to give you a breakdown of the security arrangements in Greenland and about how many troops we have there and exactly what we have there, I bet you he couldn't tell you what we have there. This goes back to Mr. Trump's ego. Donald Trump wants to be another President McKinley. He believes in manifest destiny, and he has imperial ambitions. And this is why he's talking about annexing Canada and Panama. So I think we really need to talk about, his ego and where this desire comes from. So yes, it could have, it already is having missing implications, isn't it? I mean, here we are adversaries with Denmark. And I think, Putin is seeing this as a signal, to do what he wants to do in Ukraine, and maybe this has something to do with why he hasn't agreed to a ceasefire yet, So of course, we don't know how this is going to play out, but this is like one stone in a pool, and the ripples are continuing out. And it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out over the next few months. But it's very interesting to me as an American to see how Greenland and Denmark, they seem to be coming back. There's a little bit paradoxical, situation here where the Greenlanders want to be independent, but now they see that they need Denmark in the short term. Would you agree?
Yeah, but I think that's the short term. I'd rather begin with answering the part of Thorsten's questions that I forgot before, in the sense that that what the U.S. has of rational security concerns in Greenland. The weird thing is, of course, as you began your introduction, Thorsten, that there is this Arctic, which is a big place that's. But the thing is that the most interesting about it is that it's changing, right? That it because the ice is slowly melting, there is this idea that stuff that weren't possible earlier will now be possible. So everyone wants to be a part of that. But at the same time, there's not really an understanding in many places about how big the place is. So some of the things that Trump is talking about, that there's a lot of Chinese and Russian ships there. There is an element of truth to it in the sense that now there's actually more shipping across the northern coast along the northern coast of Siberia, but that's very far from Greenland. There is a certain range of the east coast of Greenland where the U.S. doesn't have the domain awareness that it would like to have, basically because the U.S. took all the distant early warning radars back when the Cold War ended. So there's stuff, little kernels of seeds of truth in what what Trump and Vance is talking about. But the thing is that there's nothing really in the way of the US handling those security issues under the current formal arrangements, because that's basically what's been going on during the Cold War, right? So in that sense, it's a combination of lack of understanding and or perhaps strategic misunderstandings, in the sense that they need to find ways to scaffolding Trump's great vision with something that sounds rational. And of course, it's difficult for Greenlanders and Europeans and Danes to counter that, because, of course, within the North American continent, whether we like it or call it a sphere of interest or not, it's basically the US decides what will happen there.
Yeah, I just want to, I agree with everything you just said, Ulrik. And of course, I don't want to discount the importance of the Arctic. The Arctic is hugely important. And of course, we all know this, and Putin is looking at the Arctic, and China's looking at the Arctic. But there's a way of going about this, and I think the point that really comes, the thing that really comes to me, is that the way that the United States is going about this is not in a cooperative way. It's going about it in a unilateral way. We are imposing our wishes on Denmark and Greenland. I think that's, I have to say, I'm really shocked by that. But of course, the Arctic is really important. And, we need to work with Greenland, and we need to work with Denmark, and we need to bolster, our defenses there. But there's a way of going about this. We're going about this in a very sloppy and unilateral and aggressive way.
Thank you, Gordon. Let's take a few questions, if that's okay. Where I would like to start is two questions by Christian, who was in the Q&A here, that I think relate to some of what we've unpacked and Ulrik also has addressed, but perhaps we can go a little bit deeper into that. Christian asks, Greenlanders say they want to be independent and control their own future. However, in a world that is increasingly governed by the great power bilateral relations we just talked about, instead of a rules-based order, is it realistic to think that a country with such small population as Greenland will be able to avoid foreign influence in its decision-making? Ulrik, you addressed that a bit, but perhaps we can go a little bit broader, and I'll connect it with one that actually also came from Christian a little bit farther down, where he opined Greenland's government now has a stronger stance than what it used to. How do you see future Greenland-Denmark relations, and how will this relationship affect greater US-Danish-Greenland relations as this situation develops? I think that these two connect a bit, so perhaps we can address some of these aspects. Ulrik, do you want to start?
The Greenlanders, the Greenlandic politicians, very well know that it's a bold project they have, and they've been thinking and working on how to gain more control over their fate and their society and their development. Their ambition has been over the decades to, instead of having a unilateral dependence on Denmark, to kind of diversify their dependence. So they're selling fisheries rights to the European Union. At some point, they tried to get China to invest in mineral extraction because no one else did. And now they've been looking really to the US for investments and trade and tourism. And the whole ambition is, instead of being unilaterally dependent on one side, try to have a diverse range of dependencies, so that they in that regard can have more fate control. Of course, they know they'll never be left alone, because they have this strategically placed territory that is of interest to a lot of people, and that's basically the message they've been trying to convey to the US in all their communications over the last decade, that we know that we're important to your security. So we've forgotten that old narrative about demilitarization and nuclear-free zones that we were voicing in the 80s and 90s. Now we are solidly a part of the Western Alliance. We know you'll stay and military-wise, and we can live with that, and we'd like to develop connections. But then, of course, now the perspective has partly shifted in the sense that it's not just an invitation; it's also something that Greenlanders are more careful in embracing than just 3 months ago.
Gordon, did you want to comment?
I think Ulrik said it all.
One important point that has been made is, of course, the whole discussion about at least the expected resources, mineral resources, etc., that could be accessible. One question is, of course, what do we actually know about the scope of that? But that's, I guess, more speculation in many ways. What is the discourse in Greenland about this, both in terms of potential Chinese interests? I have somehow this amateur impression that we talk more about China 5-10 years ago than we do now in that regard, but I'll be happy to be stand corrected on that one. And then also more general, how do the people of Greenland look at that question now? I'm sure that there are some discussions, if not even conflicts, about how to pursue and in what ways to pursue the options of mining.
Again, there is really a difference how Greenlanders talk about resources now and 15 years ago. You know, in 2009, there was a revision of the Greenlandic autonomy arrangement, which made all profits from minerals basically go to Greenland rather than to be shared with Denmark. And it was basically meant to finance the development of the Greenlandic welfare state towards independence, but no investors showed up. So it was just after the financial crash. So Greenland, assisted by Denmark, issued some invitations to China, to Chinese investors, companies to come to Greenland and invest. And there were stuff looking like it could materialize, but it never did. So in that sense, 10 years ago, you could think of China as a player in Greenland, but that's gone. At the same time, of course, the Greenlandic discourse and debates about how much value can we get out of these mining projects has developed also. They know that the global markets don't function in a way that'll just make Greenland very rich very soon if they dig up everything. They're trying to devise their environmental regulations and their tax schemes, and they have a concept in the mining business called impact benefit agreements, so that if there's a mining project that comes into going, it'll just not be only profits taken out of the country, but some of it will stay and work in Greenland. And they've really been discussing the details of how to do that. So in that sense, they're ready for investments, but the incentive structures of the global markets for minerals haven't produced any business cases, obviously, that's worth pursuing. Basically, the geologists know a lot about what's underground in Greenland, and there's basically everything. It's more a question of whether it's worth making a production line that doesn't involve China, because they're really producing most of the most critical minerals, and maybe the global volume of demand for it doesn't warrant a separate supply chain unless the US and Europe works together to create the incentives for alternative supply chains.
So are you saying China would need to be involved to make it economically feasible?
In the current market, all the production lines basically go through China anyway. The thing is, if we want to be strategically independent of China in this regard, the European and the US authorities need in a sense to devise a different incentive schemes for Western companies to produce stuff that would be it would be cheaper to buy it in China, basically.
Thank you. In 5 minutes, I want to give back the microphone to Edward Gallagher to kind of wrap up this conversation. From my side, I'll say thank you so much again for being here. But perhaps the last question is that I would like to address is the one by Fidelma McGinn. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing names correctly. I assume she is writing, thank you for this insightful discussion that goes to the both of you. Admire the Greenlanders' mantra, nothing about us without us. Do you think their desires will be respected by both the US and Danish governments? I will perhaps rephrase that a tiny bit and say my impression is that at least Denmark claims that this is what they're trying to support and give as much of a platform and a strength to the Greenlandic government there. But what is your expectation? Will Greenland be able to stand by that mantra, and also will eventually the US government acknowledge that, or what do you expect in terms of increasing pressure?
Of course, I can't speak for Denmark. And of course, one of the things I'm interested in, I would have liked to have known is how Danes feel about how the Danish government is handling this situation. And your prime minister, who seems to be doing pretty well, I think. But I would hope that my country respects the wishes of Greenlanders. And Mr. Trump said in his speech, in the State of Union speech, he said, of course, we have to respect Greenlanders' desire for self-determination, but nothing that he has done since then, validates that. So I don't think, and ultimately he's going about this, if he is interested in Greenland in any way, he has to learn how to deal in a more respectful and diplomatic fashion. That's, I think, I think we have to remember. And I hope he does. I pray he does, not just for Greenland, but for my country.
Concerning the US, I note the same thing, that in the one sentence, Donald Trump recognizes the right of self-determination of Greenlanders, and in the next sentence, he continues that we'll get it one way or the other. Greenlanders, of course, can hear that. In a sense, Greenlanders also hear, as Thorsten pointed at, that there's actually the current prime minister, particularly, she's really, really trying and really good at trying to live up to this mantra of nothing about us without us. The trouble is that Denmark, as a society, even the Danish state as a system, tends to forget even now and then. As I mentioned in the beginning, you can go your whole life as a Dane without thinking about Greenland. The same thing as a average bureaucrat in Denmark, you can go your whole career without thinking about Greenland. So it's actually, it's a systematic error of the Danish administration also that it forgets about Greenland sometimes. And therefore, Greenlanders are bound to be disappointed even when the Danish ministers try to live up to this mantra. So it's more a question of looking at Denmark and being used to being disappointed, and looking to the United States and being a bit more afraid of the discrepancies, very dramatic discrepancies in rhetoric.
And there could be a gap between the claims that are made by Mette as prime minister and then the everyday bureaucratic realities. Yeah,
that's what Greenlanders again and again experience, right? That the Danish system, the Danish politicians, even average Dane, hear Greenlandic complaints, they react to them, and then they think, now everything's fine. And then, of course, Greenlanders are disappointed when they reasonably find something else to complain about, because there's a lot of colonial history and a lot of everyday experience of discrimination that you can meet as a Greenlander.
Well, I'm left with just saying thank you so much, Gordon and Ulrik, for joining me for this one. I learned a lot from both of you. It was a delight. And Edward, thank you so much for inviting me to be here and be able to ask some curious questions. Back to you, Edward.
Thank you, Thorsten. It's been a fascinating hour and 15 minutes, very illuminating. Thank you, Gordon and Ulrik. There's a lot more that can be said. This is an unfolding story. And I guess at this point, no one is forgetting Greenland, at least around here. And this has been a terrific event. And I think it's very much in keeping with our mission to make Americans more aware of the Nordic countries and all of the shared values and concerns that we have. We'll be continuing this dialogue, I hope, in the future. And in the meantime, again, thank you all, and thank you to all of our viewers and listeners for taking part in this. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.